I was the new assistant who changed a CEO's life. He hadn't touched a woman in 20 years.
My first days were strange. I tried to stay professional, tried to be invisible, but somehow I couldn't. He noticed me in a way no one else had ever noticed anyone. The way his eyes lingered, not in judgment, but in curiosity. And it wasn't uncomfortable at first. It was unsettlingly honest. I wasn't sure what he saw or why, but it made me careful with my words, careful with every move I made. And yet, the tension in the air was electric, like a storm was just waiting for permission to break. I remember one morning, the office completely silent, except for the low hum of the air conditioning, when he looked at me and said something that caught me off guard. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't yell. He just said, "You see things differently." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a compliment. It was an observation, but it landed in my chest like a stone. I realized then that I wasn't just another assistant. Somehow, I had become the disruption in his life, the spark that could ignite something he hadn't felt in decades. But it wasn't all easy. His life was rigid, every moment accounted for, every decision calculated, and I had to navigate carefully. He wasn't cruel, no, not at all, but he was closed off, guarded, like the walls around his heart were made of reinforced steel. And sometimes, the tiniest slip, the smallest mistake on my part, would create a ripple, a tension in the air that I could feel in my stomach. I wasn't used to that kind of pressure, not from anyone. And I couldn't tell if it was fear, respect, or something else entirely that made me feel so alive and so terrified at the same time. There were moments when I would catch him staring at the skyline beyond the windows, and I wondered what he was thinking. Did he regret the years he had spent locked away from life? Did he ever wonder what it would be like to feel, to care, to let someone in? And then, just as quickly, the moment would pass, and he would return to his desk, unreadable, untouchable, the loneliness tucked neatly back behind his perfectly tailored suits. It wasn't long before small things began to change. He started noticing my suggestions, the little ideas I offered for projects, for improvements, things that no one else had dared to mention. I could see him calculating, analyzing, weighing every word, every thought. And then, one day, he actually smiled at me. Not the polite, surface-level smile that executives give, but a real, fleeting, human smile. And for a moment, the air seemed to shift, like the walls of his life were trembling just slightly, just enough for sunlight to sneak in. I didn't know what to make of it. Was it hope? Was it fear? Was it simply a fleeting distraction in his ordered world? I couldn't tell, but I felt it too. The pull of something powerful, something dangerous, something that could unravel us both if we weren't careful. And yet, I couldn't look away. Something inside me whispered that this story, our story, was only beginning, and that nothing would ever be the same again. Every day brought a new challenge, a new moment that tested the boundaries we both lived by. I learned to watch him carefully, to read the subtle shifts in his expressions, the tightening of his jaw, the way he tapped his pen when he was frustrated or excited. And slowly, imperceptibly, we began to understand each other in a way words alone could never explain. It was fragile, it was precarious, and it was thrilling. And then, one afternoon, something happened that changed everything. A tiny mistake, something I didn't even think mattered, sent a wave of tension through the office. People were whispering, eyes were judging, and suddenly, I was caught in the middle of a storm I hadn't anticipated. He didn't yell, he didn't blame, but the way he looked at me, calm yet intense, made my heart pound. That look said everything. Fear, expectation, hope, and a challenge I wasn't sure I was ready to accept. I realized then that life, as he had built it, as he had controlled it, as he had fortified it against everyone and everything, was about to change. Not because of a business deal, not because of wealth or status, but because of me. Because I had stepped into his world, noticed the cracks, and dared to be human in a place that had almost forgotten how. And I knew, deep down, that nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. Back inside the CEO's office, late evening. The assistant and CEO sit quietly, closer now, the air lighter, but still cautious. The CEO's face shows vulnerability, softened by a rare, genuine smile. The assistant's expression reveals empathy and quiet strength. The room glows softly from a desk lamp and city lights filtering through windows, symbolizing tentative hope amid uncertainty. The mahogany desk is less imposing, and personal items like a small plant or family photo add warmth. The final image shows the assistant and CEO standing side by the large window, gazing out at the city skyline under twilight. Both look contemplative but determined. The CEO's posture is more upright, less burdened. The assistant stands confidently, hands relaxed at her sides. The scene symbolizes mutual understanding and the beginning of change. Soft, natural lighting with warm tones underscores the emotional resolution and hope. After that afternoon, the office felt different. I could sense it in the way he moved, in the pauses between his words, in the way he studied me like I had suddenly become the most important puzzle in his life. There was an intensity now, a quiet electricity that made every interaction feel like a test, a challenge, and a revelation all at once. I didn't know if I was ready for it, but somehow I couldn't step back. He began assigning me tasks that were far beyond what anyone expected of an assistant. It wasn't just about organizing schedules or filing papers anymore. It was about decisions, observations, and moments that required intuition, judgment, and courage. And each time I delivered something right, he would look at me in a way that made me feel seen, understood, and terrifyingly exposed all at once. I started noticing the small ways he reacted, the way his eyes softened when I made a point, the slight tilt of his head when he was listening, the subtle tension in his jaw when he disagreed. Every expression was a language I had to learn fast, or risk misstepping. It wasn't easy. The office wasn't a neutral space. It was a battlefield of expectations, hidden biases, and judgments that no one said out loud, but everyone felt. I saw it in the sideways glances, the whispered comments, the subtle dismissals that tried to push me back, keep me small. And every day, I realized that I had to navigate it not just for my own survival, but to prove something important, that I belonged, that my voice mattered, that even in a world stacked against me, I could stand tall. One evening, a critical error surfaced in one of the projects he was overseeing. Not a massive catastrophe, but enough to set off alarm bells. His team panicked. The executives began placing blame, their voices tight and sharp like a warning shot. I felt my stomach tighten. I could see him watching, calculating. The weight of every decision reflected in the way he leaned over his desk. And then, slowly, he turned toward me. "Can you fix this?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Not loud, not demanding, just steady, expectant, testing me. I nodded, even though my heart was pounding, even though doubt threatened to swallow me whole. I had never felt such pressure, such a combination of fear and responsibility. And yet, something inside me ignited. I realized then that he wasn't asking just for a solution. He was asking me to step into a space I had never occupied before. A place of trust, courage, and undeniable risk. And I couldn't back down. I worked through the night, barely noticing the hours passing. My hands trembled at times, my mind raced, but every choice I made, every adjustment I executed, felt like a battle for more than just a project. It was a battle for respect, for acknowledgement, for connection. I wasn't just fixing a mistake. I was proving to him and to myself that I mattered. The next morning, the results were clear. The issue was resolved, seamlessly, without fanfare. The office buzzed with quiet admiration, though no one openly celebrated. But he did something subtle, yet unforgettable. He looked at me across the room, and for a moment, his usual composed mask slipped. There was relief, pride, and something deeper, almost unspoken, swirling in his gaze. I realized then that I had passed some invisible test, that in facing this challenge, I had crossed a threshold in his perception, and perhaps in mine too. But the tension didn't dissipate completely. In fact, it grew, more intricate, more layered. I started noticing how vulnerable he had become around me, how the carefully maintained barriers he had spent decades building were beginning to crumble, just slightly, almost imperceptibly. And I felt a mixture of exhilaration and fear. I knew the smallest step, the tiniest misunderstanding, could send everything tumbling down. One afternoon, while reviewing documents together, he suddenly paused, looked up at me, and asked something I hadn't expected. "Why are you different?" His question wasn't accusatory. It wasn't judgmental. It was raw curiosity, vulnerability spilling out through a crack in his usually impenetrable facade. I hesitated, unsure how to answer, unsure what he wanted from me. I just try to see people," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. "I notice what others don't. I care, maybe more than I should." He studied me for a long moment, his eyes searching, as if weighing my words against decades of isolation, against habits, against the life he had built around being untouchable. And then he said something that made my chest tighten. "You make me remember things I thought I had buried." And in that instant, the air shifted again. I understood that he wasn't just talking about the work, or the projects, or the office. He was talking about himself, his fears, his regrets, his loneliness. And somehow, without realizing it, I had become the mirror, reflecting truths he had avoided for 20 years. From that point on, every day became more intense, more charged with emotion. Our interactions were no longer just professional. They carried a weight, a tension, and a pull that neither of us could fully explain. And yet, in that tension, in that fragile balance, I felt alive in a way I hadn't expected. I didn't know where it was heading. Was it a fleeting connection, a passing disruption, or something far more significant, something that could change both of our lives forever? I only knew one thing for certain. Life, as we had known it, would never be the same again. Days turned into weeks, and the atmosphere between us was changing in ways I could barely put into words. It wasn't just professional anymore. There was something else, a tension, a pull, an unspoken understanding that seemed to thrum in the air every time we were in the same room. I noticed it in the way he lingered over my work, the way his eyes followed my movements, the way his hands would unconsciously tap the edge of his desk whenever I spoke. And I realized, slowly, that he was struggling with something far deeper than any project or meeting. It was the walls around his life, the ones built over 20 years of solitude and control. But with that realization came pressure. The office was not a safe haven. It was a battlefield of unspoken rules, subtle discriminations, and expectations that felt impossible to meet. Every small misstep could have repercussions far beyond the immediate moment. I could see it in the way some colleagues glanced at me with skepticism, in the whispers that barely reached my ears, in the way decisions were quietly questioned behind closed doors. And yet, through all of that, he had begun to rely on me in ways he had never relied on anyone before. It was thrilling and terrifying all at once. Then one evening, something happened that shifted everything. I was reviewing documents late in the quiet office, and he appeared behind me, silent, watching me work. I felt a jolt of something, fear, anticipation, perhaps curiosity, because he never lingered like this. Normally, our interactions were calculated, measured, carefully orchestrated. But now, there was rawness in his gaze, a vulnerability that made the air feel heavy. "Have you ever wondered what it's like to truly be seen?" he asked suddenly, his voice low, almost a whisper. I froze. I hadn't expected the question, and yet it resonated deeply. I glanced at him, trying to understand what he meant. I think so," I said carefully. "Sometimes people see pieces of us, but not the whole. Why do you ask?" He didn't answer immediately. He leaned against the desk, his hands clasped together and full. For a moment, the powerful, untouchable man that everyone talked about was gone. All that remained was someone human, someone fragile, yet desperate to hold on to control he had long believed was essential. "Because," he said finally, "I haven't really been seen in 20 years. Not like this. Not like now." I could feel my heart racing. This wasn't just about him acknowledging me. It was about acknowledging himself, about acknowledging the emptiness he had carried and the fear that had kept him isolated for decades. And somehow, without meaning to, I was standing at the edge of a moment that could change everything. The days that followed became a delicate dance. Every interaction was charged with tension, every glance heavy with unspoken questions. He challenged me more, pushed me further, and tested boundaries I hadn't even realized existed. I felt his frustration, his doubt, but also a growing trust that was terrifying in its intensity. And through it all, I felt myself changing too. I was no longer just an assistant doing a job. I had become part of a story, part of a world I hadn't anticipated, and every choice I made carried weight I could barely measure. Then came the project, the one that would test everything. A critical issue arose, something that could cost millions and ruin reputations. Panic spread through the office like wildfire. The executives pointed fingers, raised voices, and tried to assign blame. I felt my stomach tighten. I could see him watching, silent, calculating, weighing the chaos against the control he had fought to maintain for so long. And then, without a word, he turned to me. "Can you handle this?" he asked, calm but firm. Not a suggestion, not a request, an acknowledgement that I was the only one who could fix it. My chest tightened. The pressure was immense, the stakes higher than anything I had faced. But I realized in that moment that this wasn't just about a project. It was about proving, to him and to myself, that we could navigate something bigger than fear, bigger than expectation, bigger than the walls he had built. I threw myself into the work, every decision deliberate, every calculation precise. Hours blurred into one another. My hands ached, my mind raced, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Every move mattered. Every choice was a test, not just of skill, but of courage. I could feel his presence behind me, steady, observing, waiting. And I knew that what happened here would define more than just our professional lives. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the problem was resolved. The office quieted. The tension lifted just slightly. I could see the subtle change in him. A weight lifted, a relief that was almost visible. He looked at me, and for the first time, the walls weren't there. His eyes held something raw. Admiration, gratitude, and something I couldn't quite name. I realized then that we had crossed a line, that something fundamental had shifted in both of us. But the moment wasn't complete. A challenge still lingered, the one we hadn't faced yet. The confrontation with ourselves, the confrontation with the fear, the isolation, the vulnerability that neither of us could ignore any longer. And I knew that it was coming. That storm was just beginning, and nothing could prepare us for what we were about to face. Every heartbeat, every glance, every word between us carried weight, and somewhere deep down, I understood that we were standing on the edge of something irreversible, something that could either shatter us completely or set us free in a way we had never imagined. That evening, everything changed. The office was quiet, almost eerily so, as if it too was holding its breath. I had stayed late, organizing documents and double-checking every detail of the project that had tested us both. I thought I knew what to expect from him, what his reactions would be, how he would handle the aftermath, but I was wrong. He appeared suddenly, his silhouette framed against the dim light from the tall windows. There was no warning in his approach, no preamble. He simply stood there, watching me, and for a moment, the air itself seemed to tense. I could feel the electricity in the room, the weight of the silence pressing down on my shoulders. My chest tightened, my pulse quickened, and I realized this was no ordinary evening, no routine check-in. Something monumental was about to unfold. "You did well today," he said, his voice calm but intense, like a quiet storm. And then he paused, his gaze locking on mine, searching. There was a depth there I had never seen before, something raw, vulnerable, terrifyingly human. "But," he continued slowly, "this isn't about the work. Not anymore. It's about us." I froze. The words hung in the air, fragile yet heavy, like a crack in a dam that had held back years of emotions, fears, and solitude. Us. The word made my heart hammer in my chest. I had felt the pull, the tension, the subtle shifts in his demeanor over weeks, but hearing it spoken aloud, framed like this, made everything real. Too real. "What? What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. My hands shook slightly as I clutched the papers in front of me, though I wasn't sure why. Was it fear? Anticipation? Or something deeper? Something I hadn't yet named? He took a step closer, not intimidating, but deliberate, and I could feel the shift in the air. I've lived my life carefully, controlled, isolated. I haven't let anyone in for 20 years. And now, his voice faltered slightly, just enough for me to see the cracks he had hidden for so long. "I don't know what to do with this. With you." It wasn't just the words. It was the honesty behind them, the vulnerability, the raw human emotion that spilled into the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. I realized then that I had been standing on the edge of this moment for weeks, feeling it in every glance, every word, every small interaction, but I hadn't fully understood its gravity. And then, the first wave hit, the confrontation with fear. His control, his power, his reputation, they all seemed to clash with something deeper. The need to feel, to connect, to break free from the isolation that had defined him for decades. I could see it in his hands, clenched and trembling slightly, in his jaw, tight yet quivering, in his eyes, wide and searching, as if pleading silently for permission to be human again. I felt it too. The storm inside me, the adrenaline, the fear, the weight of being at the center of someone else's unraveling life. And yet, beneath that fear, there was clarity, a sense of purpose I hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just about me or him. This was about truth, about breaking the chains of isolation and control, about daring to step into a space where emotions could exist without judgment. He took another step closer, and for the first time, he wasn't the untouchable CEO. He was just a man, vulnerable and real, and I could feel my own walls trembling. "I don't want to push you away," he admitted, his voice tight. "But I'm terrified. Terrified of losing control, of feeling again, of—" His words trailed off, but the meaning was clear. I swallowed hard, my own pulse racing. "Then don't," I whispered, almost to myself. "Don't push it away. Face it. Feel it. We can figure it out together." For a long, suspended moment, nothing happened. The office seemed frozen, the hum of the air conditioning the only sound. Then, slowly, he exhaled, a sound that seemed to release decades of tension all at once. And in that exhale, I understood something profound. This was the turning point. A decision had been made, though unspoken, a choice to confront vulnerability, to face fear, to allow life and connection in ways neither of us had dared before. The hours that followed were a delicate dance of understanding and acknowledgement. Every word, every gesture carried weight. Every glance was charged with unspoken meaning. And though nothing was fully resolved, the shift had occurred. The walls had cracked, the ice had begun to melt, and for the first time, I felt the possibility of something real, something dangerous, thrilling, and utterly transformative. As I left the office that night, the city lights stretched out below me, bright and endless. I felt my heart pounding, my mind racing, my soul awakened in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. I knew the story wasn't over. It was far from over. But I also knew, deep down, that everything had changed. Not just in the office, not just between us, but inside both of us. And that change, fragile and electrifying, would lead us to a place none of us could have imagined. And I couldn't wait to see what happened next. The days after that night were different. The office felt alive in a way it hadn't before. The tension that had always lingered like a shadow was still there. But now it was mixed with something new. Possibility, understanding, and an unspoken trust that neither of us could ignore. He still carried the weight of 20 years of control, of walls built high and thick, but those walls were no longer impenetrable. I could see the cracks, and I knew that change had begun. He started talking more, slowly, cautiously, like testing waters he had long avoided. He shared stories of the past, small confessions of fear, loneliness, and mistakes he hadn't dared speak aloud in decades. And with every word, I felt the human being behind the millionaire facade becoming real, vulnerable, alive. There was a raw honesty in him now, one that made the office feel both fragile and electric. And I realized that I was part of something much bigger than a job, bigger than work, bigger than either of us individually. It wasn't easy. The old patterns didn't vanish overnight. There were moments of doubt, of hesitation, when he recoiled into the familiar habits of control and distance. I could feel it, see it, and I understood. Change is terrifying, even when it's necessary. But I also saw glimpses of courage, the tiniest sparks of humanity breaking through, little acts of trust, of acknowledgement, of letting someone in. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the office itself began to transform. It wasn't just the two of us anymore. It was a shift in the energy, the culture, the way people approached one another. One evening, as the sun set behind the skyscrapers, casting golden light across the polished floors, he turned to me. "I don't know how I let myself live so long like this," he admitted, voice low, almost fragile. 20 years. I was afraid. Afraid to feel. Afraid to connect. But you reminded me that life isn't about control. It's about connection. About taking risks. About being human. I felt a lump in my throat. Those words carried decades of isolation, of fear, of unspoken regret. And yet, they also carried hope. The kind that comes when someone finally sees the truth of themselves and dares to face it. "You don't have to do it alone," I whispered. "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be you." For the first time, he smiled. Not a polite, practiced smile, but a real, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. And in that moment, I understood the power of presence, of courage, of human connection. It wasn't just about me or him. It was about what one person can do to awaken another, to break through walls built by fear and habit, to challenge the isolation that so often hides behind wealth, success, and power. And yet, even with the change, I knew the world outside still held the same injustices, the same subtle cruelties and barriers that had shaped his life and mine. It wasn't just a personal story. It was a reflection of larger truths, how fear, control, and societal pressures can isolate people, how discrimination, expectation, and privilege can distort human connection, and how courage and the empathy are sometimes the only things that can break through. As I left the office that night, walking through the city streets that glimmered like 1,000 distant stars, I felt a sense of clarity and purpose. This wasn't the end. It was a beginning. A chance to rebuild, to connect, to lead with empathy, and to carry the lessons of fear, courage, and human vulnerability into every corner of life. And I couldn't help but wonder, how many people live behind walls they've built themselves? How many allow fear, control, or the judgment of others to keep them from truly feeling, from truly connecting, from truly being alive? And what would happen if just one person dared to break through? Because sometimes it only takes one presence, one voice, one act of courage to change a life, to shift a world, and maybe, just maybe, to remind us all that being human, truly human, is the most powerful thing we can ever be.